The single dad's fingers had barely brushed the little girl's shoulder when he realized something was fundamentally wrong with the way the afternoon light passed through her skin. What Nate Baker didn't know, what he couldn't have known as he knelt on that sun-drenched pavement, was that the umbrella she clutched against her chest with both hands wasn't just an object to be returned. It was a chain binding her to an old man whose heart would fail before the week ended, and the truth about why these three souls had collided on this particular Tuesday would shatter everything Nate thought he understood about the space where life ends and something else begins. Before we continue, hit subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Nate Baker had lived the past 2 years in a fog of functional numbness, moving through his days with the mechanical precision of someone who had forgotten how to feel anything beyond the baseline requirements of survival. His daughter Gita, barely 7 years old, sat beside him in the passenger seat of their aging sedan, her small fingers tracing patterns on the fogged window as they drove through the downtown streets of their modest coastal town. The rain from the previous night had left everything gleaming and clean, the kind of deceptive brightness that made the world look renewed when nothing had actually changed at all. He had been heading to the pharmacy to refill Gita's allergy medication, another mundane task in an endless succession of mundane tasks that comprised his existence since his wife had died. The grief therapist he'd seen twice before abandoning the effort had called it going through the motions. Nate called it Tuesday or Wednesday. The days had ceased to hold distinct characteristics. They were merely intervals between sleep and waking, between breakfast and dinner, between one prescription refill and the next. The traffic light ahead blinked yellow, then red, and Nate brought the car to a halt at the intersection near Riverside Park. That was when Gita's small voice broke the silence, sharp with the kind of urgency that makes a parent's heart skip. "Daddy, that girl needs help." Nate followed his daughter's pointing finger to the sidewalk, where a child stood alone, perhaps 9 or 10 years old, wearing a pale blue dress that seemed curiously formal for a weekday afternoon. The dress reminded him of something from another era, the kind of thing his own grandmother might have worn in old photographs. The girl's dark hair hung in 2 neat braids, and she held an umbrella, closed, despite no threat of rain, with both hands pressed against her chest as though it were infinitely precious. What struck Nate most forcefully, with an inexplicable chill that raised the fine hairs along his forearms, was the girl's absolute stillness. Children didn't stand like that, frozen and purposeful, with an intensity that seemed to vibrate in the air around them. The light remained red. Nate found himself staring, unable to look away, watching as the girl's head turned slowly toward the park entrance across the street. Her profile, caught in the afternoon sun, had a translucent quality that Nate attributed to the angle of the light, though something in his chest tightened with an emotion he couldn't name. "She looks lost," Gita said, her voice smaller now, uncertain. Children possessed an instinct for wrongness that adults learned to ignore. The light changed to green, but Nate didn't move. Behind him, a horn bleated impatiently. He pulled the car to the curb instead, something deeper than logic, compelling him toward a decision he would spend weeks trying to understand. The umbrella the girl held, he could see it more clearly now, was old, its black fabric worn thin in places, the curved wooden handle polished smooth by countless hands, an object that had survived through years, through weather, through the erosion of time itself. Nate killed the engine and turned to Gita. "Stay in the car. Lock the doors." He stepped onto the sidewalk, the sun warm on his shoulders, and approached the girl with the caution one might use approaching a wild animal or a particularly vivid dream. Up close, he could see that her skin had a peculiar pallor, almost luminous, and her eyes, when she finally lifted them to meet his, were the dark brown of river stones, depthless and ancient in a way that no child's eyes should be. "Are you lost?" Nate asked, his voice emerging rougher than he'd intended. "Do you need help finding your parents?" The girl shook her head, a small, definitive movement. When she spoke, her voice carried the faint echo of something distant, like hearing words spoken in an adjacent room through a closed door. "I need to return this to Mr. Arvin. He's waiting for it. He needs it back before—" She stopped, her small throat working as though the words had caught there, too large or too terrible to release. Before what? Nate found himself asking, though part of him didn't want the answer. "Before the rain comes again. He only ever sees me when it rains. But he's running out of time, and I can't go until I give it back to him." He looked down at the umbrella, then back at the girl's pale, earnest face. Logic insisted she was simply a confused child, perhaps suffering from fever or some imaginative game that had consumed her thoughts. But the afternoon had taken on a strange, suspended quality, as though the normal rules governing reality had loosened their grip ever so slightly. "Who's Mr. Arvin?" Nate asked. "Where does he live?" The girl pointed across the street toward Riverside Park, her small hand steady. "In the care home. The one by the river. But he doesn't have much time left. The nurses don't know. Nobody knows except me." Nate should have called the police, or social services, or any of the appropriate authorities trained to handle situations involving unattended children. Instead, he found himself guiding the girl across the street, Gita hurrying to catch up despite his instructions to wait in the car. His daughter's small hand slipped into his, her presence both reassuring and disorienting, as though she served as an anchor, preventing him from drifting too far into whatever strange current had caught him. The girl, who still hadn't offered her name, and somehow Nate couldn't bring himself to ask, walked with a peculiar grace, her feet making no sound on the pavement. Nate told himself it was the soft-soled shoes children wore, though he couldn't actually see her feet beneath the hem of her dress. Everything about her seemed slightly out of focus, slightly removed from the sharp clarity of the ordinary world around them. Riverside Care Home sat at the edge of the park like a tired guardian, its brick facade weathered by decades of coastal salt air and rain. Nate had passed it countless times without truly seeing it, the way people stopped noticing familiar landmarks in their daily geography. Now, approaching it with this strange child and his own daughter in tow, the building seemed to loom larger, more significant, as though it had been waiting for precisely this moment. The girl stopped at the entrance, her grip tightening on the umbrella's handle. For the first time since Nate had approached her, something like fear flickered across her pale features. "I can't go in," she said quietly. "They won't let me. You have to take it to him. Room 237, on the second floor. Tell him Betty is sorry it took so long." The name settled into Nate's mind with unexpected weight. Betty. It sounded Scottish, matched the girl's delicate features, but something about hearing her name spoken aloud made the entire situation feel simultaneously more real and more impossible. "Why can't you take it yourself?" Nate asked, though he already knew the answer would be something he wouldn't want to hear. "Because I'm not supposed to be here anymore," Betty said simply. "Not when the sun is out. Only in the rain. That's when the door opens and he can see me. But he needs the umbrella before the rain comes again, because he won't survive another storm. His heart, it's too weak. And I can't let him die not knowing I kept my promise." Gita's hand had gone rigid in Nate's grip, and when he looked down at his daughter, her face had drained of color. Children knew things. They hadn't yet learned to explain away the impossible with adult reasoning. "Daddy," Gita whispered, "her shadow." Nate looked down at the pavement. The afternoon sun cast his own shadow, and Gita's in sharp definition against the concrete. Where Betty stood, there was nothing. No shadow darkened the ground beneath her feet. The absence was absolute, a void where physics insisted something should exist. His throat had gone dry. Every rational impulse screamed at him to gather Gita, return to the car, drive away from this madness. But Betty's eyes held his. And in them he saw something he recognized from his own mirror during the worst nights after his wife's death. The desperate need to complete one final task, to close one last circle before accepting that everything had changed irrevocably. "Please," Betty said. "He gave me the umbrella 3 years ago. I borrowed it on my way home from piano lessons, and I promised I'd bring it back the next day. But I didn't get the chance. And he's been waiting. All this time, he's been waiting and wondering why I never returned it, why I broke my promise. He doesn't know what happened to me. Please don't let him die thinking I forgot about him." The umbrella felt heavier than it should when Nate took it from Betty's small hands, as though it carried more than its physical weight. The wooden handle was smooth and warm, worn by years of use. And along its length, Nate could make out faint characters carved into the wood. Scottish script he couldn't read, but that seemed to pulse with significance beneath his fingers. Betty stepped back the moment the umbrella left her possession, and Nate could have sworn she became more translucent, more obviously not quite there. She raised one hand in a small wave, her expression carrying equal parts relief and sorrow, and then she simply wasn't anymore. Not walking away, not disappearing in any dramatic fashion, just no longer present, as though she had been edited out of reality between one blink and the next. Gita made a small sound, something between a gasp and a whimper. Nate pulled her close, feeling the solid warmth of her body against his side, a reminder that the world contained concrete things, real things, living things. "What just happened?" Gita asked, her voice muffled against his shirt. Nate had no answer. He looked down at the umbrella in his hands, at the carved characters he couldn't decipher, and made a decision that bypassed every logical process his mind might have employed. He would deliver the umbrella to room 237. He would find this Mr. Arvin. And perhaps, though he barely dared articulate the thought, he would discover that this had all been some elaborate prank, some confusion, anything explainable by the laws governing the rational world. The care home's interior smelled of disinfectant and overcooked vegetables, the universal scent of institutions housing the elderly. A young nurse at the reception desk looked up as Nate approached, Gita still clinging to his side, the umbrella held awkwardly in his free hand. "Can I help you?" The nurse's name tag identified her as Teresa, and her smile was professionally warm, but edged with the fatigue of someone working a double shift. "I'm here to see Mr. Arvin. Room 237. I have something that belongs to him." Teresa's eyebrows rose slightly as she glanced at the umbrella. "Mr. Arvin doesn't usually have visitors. Are you family?" "No, Nate paused, searching for words that wouldn't make him sound insane. "A friend asked me to return this to him. It's important." Something in his voice, or perhaps simply the oddness of someone appearing to return an umbrella on a sunny day, made Teresa nod. She gestured toward the elevator. "Second floor. Turn right off the elevator, last room on the left. But I should warn you, Mr. Arvin hasn't been well. He doesn't always make much sense when he talks. And he's quite agitated when it rains. We have to close his curtains because he stands at the window and cries. It's heartbreaking, really." The elevator rose with agonizing slowness, each floor marked by a faint bell. Nate felt Gita's hand tighten in his as they approached the second floor, her small body tense with the kind of awareness that preceded something momentous. The doors opened onto a corridor painted in soothing pastels, the kind of colors chosen to calm and comfort, but that instead felt vaguely oppressive, like being inside a faded watercolor painting. Room 237's door stood slightly ajar. Through the gap, Nate could see the foot of a hospital bed, a wheeled tray table, the corner of a window framing a square of blue sky. He knocked softly, then pushed the door wider when no response came. The man in the bed was impossibly old, his skin like tissue paper stretched over delicate bones, his white hair sparse against the pillow. An oxygen tube ran beneath his nose, and various monitors beeped quietly beside the bed, measuring out the precarious continuation of his life in electronic pulses. But his eyes were alert and dark, and fixed immediately on the umbrella in Nate's hands, with an intensity that made the room's air feel suddenly charged. "Betty," Mr. Arvin breathed, the name emerging as barely more than a whisper. "You found her. You spoke to Betty." It wasn't a question. Nate moved closer to the bed, the umbrella held before him like an offering or a talisman. "She asked me to return this to you. She said she was sorry it took so long." The old man's hands, trembling and spotted with age, reached for the umbrella. When his fingers closed around the familiar handle, tears began streaming down his weathered cheeks, cutting channels through the landscape of his face. 3 years, he said. 3 years I've been waiting. Every time it rains, I look for her. She always came in the rain, you see. Her piano teacher's studio was 2 blocks from here, and she'd walk past on Tuesdays and Thursdays. One Tuesday afternoon, it started pouring. Absolutely pouring. And she didn't have an umbrella. I was sitting on that bench outside. I could still walk then, still get around on my own. And I offered her mine. She was so polite, so grateful. She promised she'd bring it back the next Thursday. But she never came. Mr. Arvin's voice cracked, and he pulled the umbrella against his chest, the way Betty had held it on the sidewalk, as though it were the most precious object in existence. I thought she'd forgotten. I thought she was just a thoughtless child who took the umbrella and never thought of the old man again. But every time it rained, I watched for her. Even after I came here, when I could barely move from this bed, I'd make the nurses leave the curtains open during storms so I could watch the street, hoping, always hoping she'd come back and explain, that she'd return it, and we'd laugh about how long it had taken. Gita had begun crying silently, her small shoulders shaking, and Nate felt his own eyes burning. He knew he should leave, should extract himself and his daughter from this private grief. But something held him there, some sense that the story wasn't finished, that the final piece hadn't yet fallen into place. "Mr. Arvin," Nate said carefully. "What happened to Betty? Why did she stop coming?" The old man closed his eyes, and for a moment Nate thought he might have drifted into sleep or unconsciousness. But then his lips moved, forming words that came slowly, painfully, like drawing poison from a wound. "I didn't know until 6 months ago. A nurse here, Juliana. She has a daughter who went to the same school Betty attended. We were talking one day, and I mentioned the umbrella, mentioned the little Scottish girl who never returned it. Juliana went pale. She told me," Mr. Arvin's voice broke completely. "She told me Betty died 3 years ago. The Thursday she was supposed to return the umbrella. She was walking to her piano lesson, crossing the street near here. A car ran a red light. The driver was texting. She died instantly." The room seemed to contract. All the air sucked out of it. Nate felt the world tilt sideways, felt reality reassemble itself into a new and terrible configuration. Betty on the sidewalk, translucent and shadowless. Betty saying she wasn't supposed to be there when the sun was out. Betty explaining she could only appear in the rain when the boundary between worlds grew thin enough to cross. "She was 9 years old," Mr. Arvin continued, his eyes still closed. 9 years old, and she died on her way to return my umbrella. All this time I thought she'd forgotten about me. But she didn't forget. She's been trying to bring it back. That's why she only comes in the rain, isn't it? That's why I see her standing on the corner during storms, holding the umbrella, looking up at my window. She's been trying to complete her promise, but she can't cross whatever divides the living from the dead. Not when the sun shines. Not until. He stopped, his monitor beeping faster as his agitation grew. Nate wanted to comfort him, to say something that might ease the terrible weight of this revelation. But his own mind reeled with the impossibility of what he'd experienced. He had spoken to a ghost. He had touched the hand of a dead child. And somehow, through him, she had managed to complete the one task tethering her to this world. She wanted you to have it back, Nate managed. She wanted you to know she didn't forget. She kept her promise, Mr. Arvin. Even death couldn't stop her from keeping her promise. The old man opened his eyes, and in them Nate saw something shift. A release, a letting go of a burden carried for 3 years, through rain and sun and endless waiting. "Tell me," Mr. Arvin said, "did she look? Was she at peace?" Nate thought of Betty's translucent face, her ancient eyes and a child's features, the desperate urgency in her voice when she spoke about running out of time. "She will be now," he said. "She did what she came to do." The afternoon sun slanted through the window, painting everything in shades of amber and gold. Gita had moved closer to the bed, her small hand resting on the rail, her tear-stained face solemn with a wisdom beyond her years. Mr. Arvin smiled at her, a gentle expression that transformed his ancient features into something beautiful. "You have a good daughter," he said to Nate. "Hold on to her. Promise me you'll hold on to her and never let her forget how much she's loved. That's what matters. Not the things we leave undone, but the love we manage to give before our time runs out." Something in Nate's chest cracked open then, a fissure in the careful armor he'd constructed around his grief. He thought of his wife, of the thousands of small moments he'd taken for granted, of the way he'd been sleepwalking through the 2 years since her death. He thought of Gita, growing up with a father who was present but not really there, who moved through their days together without truly seeing her. He thought of Betty, trapped between worlds by a child's simple promise, unable to rest until she'd returned a borrowed umbrella. "I promise," Nate said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. 3 days later, the rain came. Not the gentle drizzle that characterized most storms in their coastal town, but a fierce downpour that turned the streets into rivers and the sky into a gray ceiling pressing down on the earth. Nate stood at the window of their small apartment, watching water sheet down the glass, and thought about umbrellas, about promises, about the debts we carry beyond death. His phone rang just after noon. Teresa from Riverside Care Home, her voice professionally sympathetic, but carrying an undercurrent of something else. Relief, perhaps, or recognition that some endings were merciful rather than tragic. "I'm calling about Mr. Arvin. He passed away this morning. It was very peaceful. He went in his sleep during the storm. I thought you might want to know, since you visited him the other day. He seemed different after you came. Calmer. More at peace. I don't know what you said to him, but it helped." Nate thanked her and ended the call, his hand trembling as he lowered the phone. Through the rain-streaked window, he could just make out Riverside Park, the trees bending beneath the storm's assault. And there, on the corner where he'd first seen her, stood a small figure in a pale blue dress. He didn't need to see her clearly to know it was Betty. But something had changed. Even from this distance, through the rain and the distortion of the water-blurred window, Nate could sense it. She wasn't standing with that desperate intensity anymore. She wasn't frozen in purposeful waiting. Instead, she stood with her face tilted up toward the rain, her arms spread wide, and Nate could have sworn she was smiling. As he watched, another figure materialized beside her, tall, thin, translucent in the gray light. Mr. Arvin, no longer bent with age, no longer confined to a hospital bed, but standing straight and strong beside the child who had waited 3 years to return his umbrella. They stood together for a long moment, two figures existing in the space between rain and reality. between life and whatever came after. Then Mr. Arvin held out his hand, and Betty took it. Together, they began to walk toward the park, toward the river beyond, moving with a lightness that defied gravity and logic. Nate blinked, and they were gone, absorbed back into the rain, released from the promises that had bound them to this world. Geeta came to stand beside him at the window, her small hand slipping into his. She'd been quieter since their encounter with Betty, more thoughtful. As though she'd glimpsed something that had changed her understanding of the world's shape and size. "She's not sad anymore," Geeta said softly. She gave back the umbrella. Nate pulled his daughter close, feeling the solid warmth of her body, the steady rhythm of her breathing. The rain continued to fall, washing the streets clean, filling the gutters with rushing water that would eventually make its way to the river, to the ocean, to whatever lay beyond the boundaries of the known world. "No," he agreed. "She's not sad anymore. She kept her promise." They stood together watching the rain, father and daughter, holding on to each other in the gray afternoon light. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside their small apartment, something had shifted. The fog that had surrounded Nate for 2 years had begun to lift, not all at once, but gradually, like rain clouds parting to reveal the sun behind them. He thought about his wife, about the love they'd shared, about the grief that had paralyzed him. He thought about promises kept and promises broken, about the weight of unfinished business and the grace of second chances. The umbrella Betty had carried across the boundary between death and life had been more than just an object. It had been a symbol of connection, of care, of the simple human act of one person helping another during a storm. Mr. Arvin had offered shelter to a child in the rain. Betty had refused to let death prevent her from honoring that kindness. And somehow, through their determination to complete one small exchange, they had taught Nate something he desperately needed to learn. The dead might linger, tethered by unfinished business, by promises made and debts unpaid. But the living could linger too, trapped in grief, frozen in the moment of loss, unable to move forward into whatever came next. Nate had been haunting his own life, a ghost moving through the days without truly inhabiting them. But standing there with Geeta's hand in his, watching the rain cleanse the world outside, he felt something within himself begin to thaw. That evening, after the rain had stopped and the clouds had begun to break apart, Nate drove Geeta to the cemetery where his wife was buried. They hadn't visited in months. He'd been avoiding it, unable to face the finality of that granite headstone, the impossible permanence of her absence. But now, with the ground still wet and the air smelling of rain and earth, he felt ready. They stood before the grave in the fading light. And Nate found himself speaking aloud for the first time since the funeral. He told his wife about Betty and Mr. Arvin, about the umbrella that had bridged the gap between worlds, about the promises we make and the lengths we go to keep them. He told her about the fog he'd been living in, about his fear of moving forward, about his terror that letting go of grief meant letting go of her. Geeta stood quietly beside him, her small hand resting on the headstone, and Nate realized his daughter had been waiting too, waiting for him to wake up, waiting for him to return from wherever he'd gone when grief swallowed him whole, waiting with the patience and hope of a child who still believed her father would find his way back. "I'm sorry I left you alone with a ghost," Nate said quietly, looking down at Geeta. "I'm sorry I've been here but not really here. Your mother wouldn't have wanted that. She wouldn't have wanted me to stop living just because she couldn't anymore." Geeta looked up at him, her eyes, so like her mother's, bright with tears. "She comes to me sometimes," she said, "in my dreams. She tells me you're going to be okay. She tells me to be patient with you, because losing someone you love is like learning to breathe underwater. It takes time to figure out how." The word struck Nate like a physical blow, stealing his breath. Of course, Gita had been grieving too. Of course, she'd been carrying her own weight, her own loss, while also trying to navigate her father's depression. He'd been so consumed by his own pain that he'd failed to see how his daughter had been struggling alone, trying to process her mother's death while also losing her father to grief. He knelt down, pulling Gita into his arms, and let himself cry for the first time since the funeral. The tears came in great, wrenching sobs that shook his entire body. 2 years of suppressed grief, finally finding release. Gita held him, her small arms tight around his neck, and he marveled at the strength in her, at the resilience that had allowed her to endure his absence while waiting for his return. "I'm here now," Nate said when he could speak again. "I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. We're going to figure out how to breathe underwater together." They stayed at the cemetery until full dark, talking about Gita's mother, remembering the good days, the ordinary moments that had comprised a life together. Nate told his daughter stories he'd been too grief-stricken to share before, and Gita told him about the dreams she'd had, about the ways she felt her mother's presence in small, unexpected moments. When they finally left, walking hand in hand back to the car through the puddles left by the day's rain, Nate felt lighter than he had in 2 years. The grief hadn't disappeared. It never would, he understood that now. But it had transformed from a suffocating weight into something he could carry, something that was part of him without consuming him entirely. The story of the umbrella made its way through the small coastal town in the way such stories do, passed from person to person, embellished and questioned, and ultimately accepted as one of those inexplicable events that occasionally puncture the fabric of ordinary life. Some people dismissed it as coincidence or delusion. Others nodded knowingly, sharing their own stories of encounters with the impossible, moments when the boundary between the living and the dead had grown thin enough to glimpse through. Nate never told the full story to anyone except Gita, knowing that some experiences existed beyond the reach of words, that trying to explain what he'd witnessed would only diminish it. But the encounter had changed him in ways that rippled outward through his life, touching everything he did. He began volunteering at Riverside Care Home, visiting the elderly residents who rarely received visitors, listening to their stories, bearing witness to their lives. He started a small program teaching residents' grandchildren about the importance of keeping promises, about how the smallest acts of kindness could echo across years and even across the boundary of death itself. Gita grew into a thoughtful, compassionate young woman who never quite forgot the afternoon she'd watched a ghostly girl fade from existence after completing a 3-year journey to return a borrowed umbrella. The experience had taught her something essential about the nature of commitment, about the weight we carry when we fail to honor our obligations to others. Years later, when Gita was herself a mother, she told her children about the summer afternoon when she and her father had encountered a ghost. She told them about promises kept and debts repaid, about the way love and obligation could transcend even death. And she made them promise that if they ever borrowed something, an umbrella, a book, a kind word, they would always find a way to return it, no matter how long it took. The umbrella itself had been cremated with Mr. Arvin, placed in his folded hands before the coffin was sealed. It seemed the only appropriate ending, the final closing of a circle that had remained open for 3 years. Somewhere, Nate liked to imagine, Betty and Mr. Arvin walked together through eternal rain, sheltered beneath that old black umbrella, finally freed from the promises that had bound them to the world of the living. On rainy days, Nate sometimes found himself standing at the window, watching the water fall from gray skies, thinking about the boundary between life and death, about the things that keep us tethered to this world even after our bodies have surrendered. He thought about his wife, about the love they'd shared, about the way grief had transformed from a prison into a bridge connecting what was to what had been. The rain continued to fall, as it always had and always would, washing the world clean and filling the spaces between things with possibility. And sometimes, in the corner of his vision, Nate thought he glimpsed figures moving through the downpour, two forms walking hand in hand, a tall man and a small girl, both of them translucent and at peace, both of them finally free of the promises that had held them between worlds. The debt had been paid, the umbrella had been returned, and in its wake, 3 souls had found release. A ghost child no longer trapped by an incomplete promise, an old man no longer waiting in vain, and a grieving father who had learned that the living could haunt themselves far more effectively than any spirit ever could. In the end, it was never really about the umbrella at all. It was about connection, about the invisible threads that bind us to each other across time and circumstance, and even death. It was about the promises we make in small moments, to lend an umbrella, to return it, to hold on to those we love, to live fully even after loss has carved us hollow. Nate had learned to breathe underwater, and every time it rained, he remembered why.